If you walked into a big box store on a Saturday afternoon in the 1990s, smelled that particular mix of plastic casing and cool, conditioned air, heard the demonstration televisions all playing different channels at once, and felt the carpet under your feet give way to polished concrete as you moved deeper into the store, you were probably in one of theirs. The blue and yellow logo, the long aisles of boxed televisions stacked ceiling high, the commission salesman in the red shirt appearing at your elbow, knowledgeable, specific, ready to spend 40 minutes explaining the difference between two amplifiers. You could spend an entire afternoon in one of those stores and feel, when you left, that you understood technology a little better than when you had arrived. At their peak, Circuit City operated 616 stores across the United States, employed 60,000 people, and posted annual revenues of more than $12 billion. They were the second largest consumer electronics retailer in the country. For a time, a significant time, they were actually the largest. Jim Collins, the management writer whose book Good to Great became required reading in business schools across the world, named Circuit City as one of only 11 companies in American history to achieve genuine, sustained greatness over a 15-year period. That was in 2001. They had survived a television industry that barely existed when they opened their first store. They survived the rise of discount retail, which threatened to undercut everything they sold. They survived the video format wars of the 1980s. They survived the recession of 1991, which closed hundreds of competing retailers. They survived the arrival of Best Buy in their own markets, kept growing, kept opening stores, kept posting profits. For 5 decades, Circuit City adapted and endured. And then, in the space of 8 years, they destroyed themselves. Not slowly, not inevitably, not because of forces beyond anyone's control. How does America's No.2 electronics retailer, a company with $12 billion in annual revenue, 60,000 employees, and a balance sheet that any competitor would have envied, end up in Chapter 11 bankruptcy and then complete liquidation in under a decade? And what really happened inside those boardrooms, on those shop floors, in those final months when the signs were already impossible to ignore? Those 2 questions are what this film is about. Stay with us. The answers are worse than you might expect. If you are finding this story as compelling as we do, leave a comment below. We read every one of them. Tell us what you remember about walking into one of these stores, or drop a suggestion for which retail story we should cover next. If you are not yet subscribed, now is a good time. We publish a new documentary every week, and this is not the last time we will be telling a story like this one. Samuel S. Wurtzel was born on the 2nd of March, 1907, in Seabright, New Jersey, the son of Jacob and Flora Wurtzel. His father was not a businessman. There was no inheritance coming. Samuel worked his way through accounting classes at the Pace School, at City College, and eventually at New York University. Not a degree program with a grand graduation ceremony, but night classes, certificate courses, the kind of education you chase between shifts. He was practical before he was anything else. By 1938, Samuel was working in New York City for packing products, an importer-exporter, and he stayed there for 9 years. He was good at the work. He understood how goods moved from one place to another, how margins were built, how relationships with suppliers determined whether you prospered or struggled. When he eventually sold that business, he had enough money to take a vacation, something most men of his background rarely managed. He took his wife Ruth and their sons Alan and David to Richmond, Virginia. He went to get a haircut, The barber, whose name history has not recorded, mentioned to his customer that Richmond was about to become home to the first commercial television station in the American South. Wurzel sat in the chair and did the arithmetic quietly. Televisions were still a novelty in most American homes. Fewer than 8% of households owned one in 1949. But if a local station was coming, with local news, local sports, local faces, demand in this city was about to climb faster than the national average. Richmond residents would want to watch themselves on television. Samuel Wurzel cancelled his plans to return to New York. He moved the family to Richmond permanently and opened a small retail store selling television sets. He called it Ward's. The name was not chosen for elegance. It was an acronym: W for Wurzel, A for his son Alan, R for his wife Ruth, D for his son David, S for Samuel himself. The store was a family name made visible. Every letter stood for someone he was responsible for. The store was modest, a single retail floor selling televisions in a city where most people had never owned one. Wurzel had no retail experience in electronics. He had no background in consumer goods. What he had was the arithmetic he had done in the barber's chair, and a temperament that preferred action over deliberation. He had left New York, uprooted his family, and opened a shop in a city he barely knew, all on the strength of a conversation with a man holding a pair of scissors. That willingness to move fast on a clear opportunity, to commit everything before the moment passed, would define the company's best decades. It would also define its worst. Abraham L. Hecht joined Wurzel as a business partner shortly after the store opened. Hecht brought additional capital and operational steadiness. Together, the two men built Ward's TV into a 4-store operation around Richmond by 1959. The television was not yet a commodity. Each set was a considered purchase, a significant expense, something a family saved toward. Selling them required explanation, demonstration, and patience. Wurzel's salespeople had to know the product. That, too, would become foundational. What is remarkable, in retrospect, is how early Samuel Wurzel identified his formula and how consistently he applied it. He was not chasing trends. He was reading them. When the television boom began, he was already there. When appliances followed, he was ready. He was not a disruptor in the modern sense. He was a meticulous observer who moved the moment the signal was clear. The barber's chair story is not a charming coincidence. It is the essential explanation for everything that followed, and for what was eventually lost when people who thought they understood that formula actually didn't. By 1953, the number of American households owning a television, Samuel Wurzel had been right about the direction. What he had not fully anticipated was the speed. 4 Ward's stores operated across the Richmond area by the late 1950s, each selling between 5,000 and 8,000 square feet of televisions and home appliances. The stores were not large by later standards, but they were well stocked and well staffed. Wurzel had added appliances to the product mix by 1952, capitalizing on the post-war demand for refrigerators, washing machines, and electric stoves. American families who had gone without during the Depression and the war years were now buying domestic goods with a fervor that surprised even the optimists. The first major test came with the rise of discount retail. The concept arrived in New England around 1953. A massive retail facility selling goods at a fraction of the manufacturer's list price, built on volume rather than margin. The idea spread quickly. Traditional retailers, accustomed to full-price sales and customer loyalty built on service, found themselves undercut by stores that prioritized price above everything else. Wurzel did not resist the trend. He joined it. In 1960, he accepted an invitation from the discount retailer National Belles Hesse to open a licensed department, a store within a store, at their brand new facility in Atlanta. The licensed department model meant wards operated a dedicated electronics section inside a larger discount store, benefiting from the foot traffic without bearing the full cost of standalone premises. It worked. The company expanded the licensed department model nationally through the 1960s, operating in discount stores across multiple states. This was the first survival. A less adaptable company would have seen discount retail as the enemy and dug in. Wurzel saw it as a distribution channel and used it. The company also survived an identity crisis in the late 1960s. In 1965, Wards purchased the Richmond Carousel Corporation, a discount department store that sold automotive supplies, clothing, children's toys, and household goods, alongside appliances. Then, in September 1965, they acquired Mermick Incorporated, a Delaware company operating hardware and housewares departments in southeastern stores. For a moment, Wards looked like it might drift into general merchandise. Another Kmart rather than a specialist. Company sales reached $23 million, but the core remained electronics, and the licensed departments remained the growth engine. The first genuine existential threat came in the early 1970s. By 1969, the company had begun buying up local chains and expanding aggressively. The balance sheet was stretched. Department stores were struggling nationally. The licensed department model, which had driven growth, was under pressure as the discount stores themselves faced competition from a new generation of purpose-built big-box retailers. The growth that had seemed automatic in the 1960s was suddenly uncertain. Alan Wurzel, Samuel's son, had returned to Richmond in 1966 as Vice President of Legal Affairs. He had an undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and a law degree from Yale, and he was watching the business carefully. In 1970, Samuel stepped back from the presidency. Alan was named president. 2 years later, in 1972, he became chief executive. He was 38 years old. Alan's inheritance was a company at a crossroads. The licensed department model was showing its limits. The general merchandise experiment was a distraction. The competition was changing shape. What the company needed was a clear identity, and Alan had one in mind. In 1974, the company began closing its licensed departments and opened its first new concept, the Wards Loading Dock. It was a 40,000 square foot retail warehouse showroom in Richmond, Virginia, combining audio equipment and major appliances in a format nobody had tried at that scale. Concrete floors, high shelving, products stacked and displayed in a way that communicated abundance, variety, and competitive pricing. It was the prototype for what the industry would eventually call the electronics superstore. The loading dock worked. The format was refined and expanded. And in 1977, the company opened a new concept under a new name in the Washington, D.C. area. Showrooms of between 6,000 and 7,000 square feet, carrying top audio-visual brands with in-store service departments and knowledgeable sales staff. They called it Circuit City. The name that would define the next 3 decades had been born from a warehouse in Richmond and a lawyer who had inherited his father's instinct for timing. The question was how long that instinct would survive the men who came after. Chapter 3. The Superstore, the salesman in the red shirt, and the years everything worked. By the mid-1980s, the Circuit City format was no longer an experiment. It was a machine. A typical Circuit City store in 1985 covered between 30,000 and 45,000 square feet of selling floor. The layout was deliberate. Appliances along one wall, audio equipment in the middle, televisions in their own theatre-lit section at the back, where a dozen sets played simultaneously on wall-mounted brackets. The carpet was grey, the ceiling was high, the air was kept slightly cool, the way electronics retailers have always kept their stores. Cool enough that the products seemed to belong to a different, more precise world than the one customers had just walked in from. The sales staff wore red shirts. That detail mattered more than it might seem. A red shirt was visible from 30 feet. It communicated availability. Circuit City trained its sales associates extensively in the technical specifications of every product they carried. A customer asking about the difference between 2 amplifiers or 2 televisions would receive a detailed, accurate answer, and would often be told, without embarrassment, when the cheaper option was actually the better one for their needs. That honesty built a reputation that competitors found difficult to replicate. And because of this level of service, customers came back again and again. The company also built its own proprietary technology. Circuit City developed point-of-sale systems, cash registers, scanners, inventory software, before most retailers understood why such systems mattered. Their technology allowed real-time tracking of sales, meaning that inventory decisions could be made daily rather than monthly, and that commissions could be calculated accurately to the transaction. In a period when most retailers were still working from paper ledgers and weekly stock counts, Circuit City was operating something close to a live map of its own business. This technology edge came partly from a man named Richard L. Sharp. Born on the 12th of April, 1947, in Washington, D.C., Sharp had studied electrical engineering and had founded a technology company called Applied Computer Systems, which sold point-of-sale software and hardware to retailers, including Wards. He met Alan Wurtzel in 1978, and the relationship deepened over the following years. In 1982, Sharp joined the company as executive vice president, bringing his technology fluency into the operational core of the business. In 1984, the company formally renamed itself Circuit City Stores, Incorporated. It listed on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker CC. Alan Wurtzel stepped back to become chairman, and Sharp was named president. 2 years later, in 1986, Sharp became chief executive. Samuel Wurtzel, the founder, died in 1985. He had seen the company he built in a Richmond barbershop conversation grow to more than $250 million in annual revenue. He did not live to see it become something far larger, or to see what happened when it was gone. Under Sharp's leadership, the growth was extraordinary. Under Sharp's leadership, the growth was extraordinary. Revenue climbed from $175 million in 1986 to $12.6 billion by the time he retired in 2000. The number of stores rose from 69 in 1988 to more than 616 by the year of his departure. Net profit went from $22 million to $327 million. The company became a Fortune 500 constituent. It opened stores from coast to coast, from New Hampshire to Hawaii, And for several years in the early 1990s, it was the single largest consumer electronics retailer in the United States. And for several years in the early 1990s, it was the single largest consumer electronics retailer in the United States. The communities around Circuit City's major distribution and operations hubs felt the employment directly. The corporate headquarters at 9950 Mayland Drive in Richmond, Virginia, became one of the largest private employers in the city. Thousands of families in the Richmond metropolitan area had at least one member working for the company. In the stores, in the distribution centers in Columbus, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky, in the technical service operations, in corporate functions. For many of those families, Circuit City was not just an employer. It was a career. In 1993, Sharp and his team launched CarMax, a used car superstore concept built on the same principles that had made Circuit City work. No haggle pricing, wide selection, knowledgeable staff, transparent information. CarMax opened its first location in Richmond in 1993 and expanded rapidly. By the late 1990s, it was arguably the most profitable and innovative thing the company had created. Sharp eventually served simultaneously as chairman and CEO of both Circuit City and CarMax, a double role that would have consequences nobody fully anticipated. The first sign that something had changed was not a scandal. It was not a dramatic loss or a public failure. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more dangerous. By the late 1990s, Circuit City's store estate was aging. Many locations that had been opened quickly in the expansion years of the late 1980s were now old. Built in second-tier shopping centers, with dated layouts and interiors that had not kept pace with what Best Buy was building across the country. Best Buy, which had started in 1966 as Sound of Music, a small audio retailer in St. Paul, Minnesota, had spent its growth years doing something Circuit City had not, choosing real estate with the same discipline it applied to merchandise. Best Buy's concept. 3 stores, which it began rolling out in the early 1990s, ran between 45,000 and 58,000 square feet. Larger than Circuit City's standard format, with wider aisles, more hands-on product displays, and a brighter, more open visual presentation. Best Buy also made a strategic decision that Circuit City would only understand in hindsight. Best Buy moved away from commissioned sales. It shifted to an hourly wage model, allowing customers to browse without a salesperson appearing at their elbow. For a generation of consumers who were increasingly comfortable researching products themselves, using the early internet, reading consumer magazines, comparing specifications at home before they entered the store, the pressure-free browsing experience felt like liberation. Best Buy's stores were louder, more energetic, and in many ways less sophisticated than Circuit City's. But they were growing faster. Sharp retired as CEO in 2000 and left the board in 2002. The man who replaced him was W. Allen McCullough, who had joined Circuit City in 1987 as General Manager of Corporate Operations and had served as President and Chief Operating Officer since 1997. McCullough became chief executive in the same year that several digital product categories DVD players, digital cameras, large-screen televisions, were arriving in stores and creating a new wave of consumer demand. It should have been an excellent moment to inherit a well-resourced retailer. Instead, McCullough's first major decision set the company on a course from which it never recovered. In July 2000, McCullough announced that Circuit City would exit the home appliance business entirely. Refrigerators, washing machines, dishwashers, electric stoves, all of it. Gone from every one of the company's 553 US stores as quickly as the remodeling work could be completed. What almost nobody discussed publicly at the time was the number attached to the decision. In the fiscal year ending in early 2000, Circuit City had earned just under $1.6 billion in revenue from appliance sales. They were the second largest appliance retailer in the United States. It was an amputation. Circuit City's share price fell nearly 20% on the day of the announcement. Analysts at the time expressed reservations, but the decision stood. The company committed to a $1 billion store renovation program. All 553 locations were to be redesigned and re-merchandised, at an average cost of $2.5 million per store. The new format, called Horizon, replaced the original showroom layout with higher ceilings, lower fixtures, and an open-plan selling floor that looked, to many observers, uncomfortably similar to what Best Buy had already been building for a decade. What the company could not have foreseen, though some analysts suggested it, was that the years immediately following the appliance exit would see one of the greatest residential housing booms in American history. Between 2001 and 2006, new home construction reached volumes not seen since the post-war years. Millions of new homeowners needed appliances. Sales of refrigerators, washing machines, and dishwashers climbed year after year. Home Depot and Lowe's absorbed the demand that Circuit City had voluntarily abandoned. And then, in 2002, McCullough made a second decision that compounded the first. He spun off CarMax, the used car division, as an independent, publicly traded company. CarMax was generating more consistent profit than the electronics business. Releasing it freed cash in the short term, but removed the company's most reliable earnings source at precisely the moment when the electronics business needed stability. By 2003, Circuit City had lost its position as the market leader in consumer electronics to Best Buy. In its own home city of Richmond, Virginia, Best Buy opened a new, larger store within sight of some Circuit City locations and immediately began drawing the crowds. The company that had invented the electronics superstore was now playing catch-up in a format it had pioneered. The cracks were visible. They were wide enough to see across, but the management team seemed to believe that the Horizon renovation program would close them. They had no idea what was coming. Chapter 5. The Man with the Bonus and the Morning It Became Permanent. Philip J. Schoonover joined Circuit City in 2004 as Executive Vice President and Chief Merchandising Officer. He came from Best Buy and Sony. He was, on paper, exactly what the company needed, someone who had worked inside the competition, understood the merchandise landscape, and could bring a fresh perspective to a business that had been losing ground for 4 years. He became president in early 2005. When Alan McCullough stepped down, Schoonover was confirmed as Chief Executive Officer. He was, at that moment, the most senior retail executive in the company's history, who had no personal memory of the business under the Wurzels. Schoonover's first years were marked by the search for a strategy that would reverse the decline. He talked about digital home services, Circuit City becoming not just a retailer of electronics, but a provider of installation, connectivity, and technical support. He talked about multi-channel retailing, about the company's website, about new store formats. But none of these ideas produced measurable results, and the financial pressure was building. The company had lost $11.8 million in the fiscal year ending February 2007. It was not a catastrophic loss by the standards of a $12 billion business. But it was a loss, and the board was demanding action. There had been every chance to choose differently. Someone chose not to. On the 28th of March, 2007, Circuit City announced what it called a wage management initiative. The company would immediately terminate 3,400 store employees, approximately 8% of its total workforce, on the grounds that they were paid well above the market-based salary range for their role. These were not underperforming staff. They were not redundant positions. They were, by the company's own admission, people who had been doing their jobs well enough for long enough, that their pay had risen above what Schoonover's team had decided the market required. The terminated employees would receive a severance package. They could reapply for their own positions after a 10-week waiting period. They would be hired back, if at all, at a lower wage, what the company called current market range. Betty Owen, one of 19 workers let go at the El Paso, Texas location, spoke to the El Paso Times the morning of the announcement. "I was a part-time person and only made $10.10 an hour," she said, "and I still got laid off." Owen had extensive technical experience from previous employment. She had worked at Circuit City for 3 years. The colleagues fired alongside her, she noted, had mostly been with the company far longer and were earning higher wages because of it. A worker at a Manhattan store, speaking anonymously to the newspaper The Militant, described the morning of March 28th in direct terms. "Several co-workers came in and without warning were told they were fired," he said. "I've worked here for years and I know this product. The customers know me. And now they want me to come back at a lower pay after 10 weeks, like nothing happened." What was the financial rationale? Company spokesman Jim Babb told journalists the program would save approximately $110 million in the current fiscal year and $140 million per year after that. Schoonover himself framed it in a prepared statement as necessary to deliver improvements in our selling, general and administrative expense rate. The analyst Colin McGranahan at Bernstein noted, with what proved to be considerable understatement, that it stands to reason that firing 3,400 of arguably the most successful salespeople in the company could prove terrible for morale. The detail that never fully made the headlines, or rather was buried under the larger outrage, was this. On the same day, Circuit City announced it could not afford to pay experienced salespeople more than the market range. Philip Schoonover's compensation was disclosed in company filings. His base salary was $716,346. His bonus was $704,700. His long-term compensation included $3 million in stock awards and a further $340,000 in underlying options. His total 2006 compensation, according to Forbes, exceeded $4.5 million, with a further $5.4 million in stock option value. The 3,400 people fired on the 28th of March were earning in many cases between $10 and $14 per hour. They were being told that this, barely above poverty-level wages for a family of 4, was well above market range. The man making that argument was collecting compensation that year of nearly $10 million. There had been every chance to choose differently. Someone chose not to. The consequences of the March 2007 layoffs were not invisible. They were apparent within weeks to anyone who entered a Circuit City store. The veteran salespeople had gone. In their place were new hires, people who, by company admission, needed no prior sales experience and would be trained from scratch. In a business where product knowledge was the primary competitive advantage over online retailers and warehouse clubs, this was not a staffing adjustment. It was an erasure. A customer asking a question about the technical specifications of a high-definition television or the compatibility between a home theater receiver and a specific speaker system now frequently encountered a salesperson who could not answer them. Best Buy's salespeople were not notably more expert, but Best Buy had never built its identity on expertise. Circuit City had. The financial savings did not materialize as projected. The $110 million in annual savings never appeared in the results. What appeared instead was a measurable decline in comparable store sales, the metric that tracks performance at existing locations year over year as customers who had been loyal to specific salespeople found those people gone. In the second quarter of fiscal 2007, comparable store sales fell 8%. Best Buy, in the same period, reported gains. Alan Wurtzel, watching from outside the company he had built, was not in a position to intervene. He had sold all of his Circuit City stock in 2000 and left the board in 2001. Very, very sad, was his response. He had seen this coming. He had said, years earlier, that the company had stopped making the investments needed to stay competitive. Nobody inside the building had been listening. The company also attempted a Canadian expansion that ended in humiliation. In April 2004, under McAuliffe, Circuit City had paid approximately $284 million for Intertan, a chain of 980 small-format stores in Canada operating under the Radio Shack and Rogers Plus names. Radio Shack's parent company promptly sued over the brand usage in Canada. Circuit City lost the lawsuit. All Canadian locations had to be renamed. They became The Source by Circuit City in 2005. The chain was then sold to Bell Canada at a loss. The $284 million acquisition had produced nothing. The money was simply gone. By 2006, the company had closed 55 Canadian stores and exited the Intertan investment at a fraction of the purchase price. The distribution centers in Columbus, Ohio and Louisville, Kentucky, built to serve a supply chain that had once moved $12 billion in goods per year, were closed in early 2007. 7 more U.S. stores were shut. The IT infrastructure operations at the Richmond headquarters were outsourced to IBM, eliminating 130 jobs at the corporate campus on Mayland Drive, with approximately 80 of those workers let go entirely. In May 2007, Blockbuster Incorporated, itself a company in deep trouble, opened Circuit City's books as part of an exploratory acquisition discussion. The talks went nowhere. In early 2008, the hedge fund Highfields Capital Management, which had previously acquired a significant stake in Circuit City, submitted a buyout offer. The board declined. They believed, as board members of failing companies often do, that the company's intrinsic value exceeded what any buyer was willing to pay. By mid-2008, cash reserves had fallen from $297 million to $92 million in 6 months. The global financial crisis that began in September 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers removed whatever remained of the company's options. Going into the crucial holiday shopping season of 2008 with half-empty shelves was not a recovery plan. It was a death sentence. On the 10th of November 2008, Circuit City Stores Incorporated filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Eastern District of Virginia in Richmond, the same city where Samuel Wurtzel had opened his first television shop 59 years earlier. The filing cited total debts of approximately $2.3 billion against assets that the company could not fully service. The company secured $1.1 billion in debtor-in-possession financing from Bank of America to continue operating through the bankruptcy process. 2 potential buyers were identified during the restructuring period. Neither was able to raise the financing required. U.S. bankruptcy judge Kevin R. Huenekens, who presided over the case, had previously given the company permission to proceed directly to liquidation if a buyer was not found. In January 2009, that condition was met. Philip Schoonover had resigned as chief executive in September 2008, weeks before the bankruptcy filing. He did not stay to see the end. James A. Markham, a board member, was named acting chief executive. His statement on the 16th of January 2009, when the liquidation was announced, was brief. "This is the only possible path for our company. We are extremely disappointed by this outcome." Sandy Feldman, Senior Vice President of Great American Group, one of 4 firms hired to manage the liquidation, told the Washington Post that approximately $2 billion of retail inventory would be sold through the store closure sales. "We've got to be out of the stores by March 31st, he said. The holiday shopping season that had just ended was, according to industry reports, the worst in 4 decades. The stores did not close all at once on a single morning. The going out of business sales ran from mid-January through early March, and the experience inside the stores during those final weeks was unlike anything their employees had encountered. Shelves emptied and were not restocked. Display units were sold, the floor models, the demonstration televisions, the speaker systems that had played music every day for years. Customers who had never found Circuit City's prices compelling enough to walk through the door came to buy things at liquidation prices they had never been offered before. Outside a store in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a woman named Sonia Webb stood watching as a store employee helped load a 46-inch Sony television into her car. "Since my childhood, that's been where you go to buy electronics, Circuit City," she told the reporter. "I usually compared Circuit City, Best Buy and Sears, but Circuit City was always my preferred choice." She paused, and then she said something that will resonate with anyone who remembers. "It's sad." March 8, 2009, was a Sunday. The final stores closed that evening. There was no ceremony, no announcement over the intercom. No executive from the Richmond headquarters flew in to stand at the doors. The last customers bought the last items from the last shelves and left. Employees locked the doors and handed back their keys. The lights in 567 stores across the United States went dark within hours of each other, and the circuit was broken. The final tally: 34,000 jobs eliminated in the liquidation alone. Added to the 3,400 let go in March 2007, the smaller closures of 2007 and 2008, and the total number of people who lost their employment in the Circuit City collapse ran well above 40,000. For the workers who had built careers inside the company, who had spent 15 or 20 years learning product lines, building customer relationships, rising through store management into regional and district roles, there was no equivalent employment available. National coverage was widespread in January 2009. But by March, the financial crisis had produced so many other casualties that the death of a single retail chain received only moderate attention. The 34,000 people who lost their jobs that spring were a footnote in larger economic journalism. Chapter 8. The Silence and What Remained. The two questions asked at the opening of this film can now be answered fully. How does a company with $12 billion in annual revenue, 60,000 employees, and a book named after its success end up in total liquidation in less than a decade? The answer is not a single decision. It is a sequence of decisions, each one made by a named person in a specific room for specific reasons. Alan McCullough abandoned $1.6 billion in appliance revenue in July 2000. He spun off CarMax in 2002. He spent $284 million on a Canadian acquisition that failed. Philip Schoonover inherited a weakened company and fired 3,400 of the most experienced salespeople to save $110 million a year, while collecting $10 million in personal compensation himself. He then watched customer satisfaction collapse until there was nothing left to do but file for bankruptcy. The irony is precise and painful. Circuit City built its reputation on knowing more about electronics than anyone else. It destroyed itself by concluding, in the end, that the knowledge didn't matter. That was a philosophical error disguised as a spreadsheet. What sits at 9,950 Mayland Drive in Richmond, Virginia today? The corporate headquarters building still stands. It is now occupied by multiple tenants, the anchor of a business campus that has nothing to do with consumer electronics. The former Circuit City locations across the country followed several paths. Many became the big box vacancies that haunted American retail real estate through the 2010s, large, difficult to repurpose spaces sitting empty. Others were taken over by Best Buy. Some became furniture stores, fitness centers, or church congregations that found the open plan format suited their needs. The spaces are still there, in most cases. The identity that once filled them is not. What almost nobody knew at the time was that Circuit City had, as recently as 2003, received a $3.25 per share unsolicited takeover approach from Carlos Slim. The board rejected it. They also rejected the Highfields Capital bid in 2005 at $17 per share. By 2008, the share price had fallen below $1. The CarMax story adds its own layer of irony. Today, CarMax is a publicly traded company generating more than $30 billion in annual revenue, employing over 30,000 people. The child outlived the parent. The child is flourishing. Circuit City exists only as a brand name licensed to an online operation run out of Florida. The stores are gone. The expertise is gone. What remains is a web address and a logo that means something to people of a certain age. The question of who bears responsibility is not simple. Richard Sharp, Alan McCullough, and Philip Schoonover each bear their share. The company was not destroyed by the internet or globalization. It was destroyed by decisions made in Richmond, Virginia. They had every chance to survive. Someone chose not to let them. Because the people who built that company deserve to be remembered. And the decisions that destroyed it deserve to be understood, so that the next generation of companies and the people who work inside them can see what happens when expertise is treated as a line item rather than the reason customers walk through the door. If you shopped at Circuit City, If you were helped by someone in a red shirt who knew the answer to your question. If you carried a television out to your car on a Saturday afternoon from a store that no longer exists, you already know what was lost. Because the people who built that company, the ones who knew the product and served the customers and kept the stores running for 60 years, deserve to be remembered. The decisions that destroyed it deserve to be understood. Subscribe for new industrial and retail documentaries every week. The next story is already being researched.